The Bedford Historical Society Speaker Series is supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, and also in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Ohio Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, or the Bedford Historical Society.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our speaker series tonight. I do want to also remind you the 60th anniversary of the Strawberry Festival is coming up, June 7th, 8th, and 9th. And the week before the Strawberry Festival, we're having a kickoff with a car show and a little bit of a ice cream social. So come and spend some time here on the square at the festival, in the museum. We also will have a lot of crafters, of course, and we'll have a lot of artists in the museum. So come and see everything. Now I'd like to introduce to you Lucretia Garfield.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm so pleased to be in front of the fine people of Bedford and the surrounding area this evening. President Garfield sends his warmest regards from the Executive Mansion to all of you. He reminded me before I left Washington that he has many fond memories of this area. Some of you may be friends with his aunt and uncle, the Skinners. James would spend every early September for many years in a row with his Uncle Joseph and his Aunt Callista here in Bedford during the yearly big meeting of the Disciples of Christ Church. And some of you may have had family members where my husband preached a sermon at their funerals. Or on a better note, maybe he helped unite some of your neighbors in marriage. I was so pleased to accept Miss Lee's wonderful invitation to join you folks this evening. It afforded me the opportunity to escape the evil of the White House. Malaria, at least for a little while. Now, Ms. Lee asked if I could talk about my recollections of the courtship and marriage between James Garfield of Orange Township and me from Portage County. And I fear that you might be a bit surprised when you hear some of the details. So I hope I don't disappoint you too much. I was born in Garrettsville, April 19th of 1832, on my parents' farm. And I was the oldest of 4 children to Arabella and Zeb Rudolph. Being the oldest means you get all the responsibilities and the chores. And my mother believed in something called self-government, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, taking the responsibility for things. And that's what we were taught at home, besides sewing, baking bread, making a turkey for Thanksgiving. I have 2 brothers, John and Joseph, and a sister, a younger sister, Nellie. I did not have a very affectionate upbringing, and that's part of the differences that I want to talk about tonight. Mr. Garfield and I were raised very differently, and we have very different temperaments because of it. Well, my household was very serious. I don't ever remember my father embracing me, and my mother rarely did. But they felt that religion and education were very important, and somehow my siblings and I knew that we were loved, even though we had this very serious, quiet household. It caused me to grow up as a very shy girl, very reserved. Some of my friends even called me cold when I was young and going to school. So you can see where I'm coming from with my temperament, a more reserved young lady. And my parents felt that education was so important, not only for my two brothers, but for my sister Nellie and me as well. And so we went to the local schools, the one-room schoolhouses, to get as much education as we could. Meanwhile, James Garfield of Orange Township was born in a log home in the woods, the last of 5 children to Abram and Eliza Garfield. He had 2 older sisters and an older brother, and even another brother named James that unfortunately died young, just a couple years before my James was born. The family was a frontier family here on the Western Reserve, in the woods, making the best that they could out of their little farm and their log home. And then in May of 1833, there was a fire. My James was only 18 months old. He had been born on November 19th, 1831. Only 18 months old when the fire broke out on their farmstead. And Abram worked so hard to quell the fire and keep it from consuming the family's log home. And he accomplished that. When he finished putting out the last bit of fire, he walked up to the cabin doorway and sat down and said to James's mother, "Eliza, we put these 4 saplings in the woods, and now I leave them in your care." And he died. He was in his young 30s. And now Eliza and the 4 children had to find a way to go on without a man in the household. James's brother Thomas was 10 years older, and he became the man of that log home. The sisters helped with everything. Mother chopped wood and made fences, and Eliza was a firm and a very strong woman. But she also had a fun side as well. She would sing to her children in the evening after the chores were done, and she insisted that she keep them all together. You know, back then in the 1830s, you would parcel out your children if you became a widow, you know, having other relatives raise them for you. But she was insistent on keeping her little family together. And so this is James Garfield's family. He's the baby. He's the center of attention. He's doted upon. You know, in the evenings, he's on mother's lap and being sung to and cuddled. And he enjoyed being the center of attention. Very opposite of me. He was a very precocious child, reading at 3 from the Bible. And his mother told me that once he learned to walk, he never sat still a minute. Now, Sister Hitty carried him to school, sometimes all the way to Chagrin Falls, for schooling in the one-room schoolhouses. And like all of us farmers, you went to school mostly in the winter, after the harvest was taken in and before planting again. And finally, Eliza gave a corner of her farm property so that a log school could be built there. And her 4 children, the neighbors who were cousins of James Garfield, and some of the other area children could attend school without going all the way to Chagrin Falls. When James Garfield was close to 16 years old, his mother gave him her life savings that she had accumulated up to that point, $17, so that he could go to school and better himself. And so in 1848, James and I crossed paths at the Geauga Seminary in Chester Township. My parents had packed me up in a wagon with my belongings and headed west almost 30 miles to get to Chester Township. And it was my first time being away from home. The girls boarded on the 3rd floor of the school. The boys had to find housing within the community. And there we were, classmates, learning our Greek and Latin and history and literature. And James Garfield, I have to tell you about my first impressions. He was the tallest boy in the class. He was almost 6 feet tall already at 16 years old. And he had the look of an uncombed, unwashed boy. His clothes were not the finest out of anyone in the room. He had patches and such. And he had hair that stood up like he had never seen a haircut. And bright blue eyes, ladies. I thought he was some sort of strange genius because he was not only the tallest boy in the class, he was also the smartest. He wanted to make something of himself. He wanted to push himself so he could achieve things that children with fathers could do. He wanted to leave his mark in the world. So we were classmates at the Geauga Seminary. He was in love with Mary Hubble. And I had my dapper Albert Hall. So we concluded our time in Chester Township. In 1850, I was enrolled in the very first term at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, a college on the hill there. My father was one of the 5 founders of the school, and being a carpenter, he even helped build the first building. And I told you my parents were very much fond of education, felt it was highly important, so I was enrolled in the very first fall term there in 1850. My mother insisted that the family move to Hiram, a few miles away from Garrettsville, so we could be closer to this school. And it was a school started by the disciples of Christ, but it was non-sectarian and co-educational. Very unusual for its day. So a year later, who crosses paths with me there again? But James Garfield of Orange Township. He and a couple of his cousins and a friend from Orange came down to the school in Hiram and joined me in classes in 1851. We had our Greek and Latin translation classes together, and literature, biology, arithmetic. We had singing school in the evenings, a fine sleigh ride in the winters in Hiram on those hills. We were classmates until 1853, when our Greek professor became ill. And who do you think they put in charge of the class? James Garfield. He was once again ahead of the rest of us in our studies, and they put him in charge of the class. So he even was my teacher for a brief while at that point. It came time for the Greek class to have their photograph taken in 1853. And James Garfield whispered to the photographer and asked if he could be seated next to Miss Rudolph. I look a bit disconcerted in this picture with him really crowding into me here at the far right side. Yes, Jenny helped me out here in this picture. She let me lean on her a bit. But this is our Greek class of 1853. That same year, James took a trip with his mother to New England to visit relatives. And he wrote the first of what would be, I think we have about 1,200 letters now that we've shared. But I remember that one as if it was yesterday. My dear Lucretia, pardon the liberty I take in pointing my pen your direction this evening, for I have seen scenery that is so amazing I cannot contain it all myself. Do you know what he had passed on the way to New England? Not New York City, but that's a good guess. Niagara Falls. Those cataracts, and he wanted to write and share that experience with me. So that was the first of the many letters. Now you ladies know that once you receive a letter like that from a gentleman, your neighbors and your family consider you engaged. But things didn't happen that quickly for us. We finished our schooling at the Eclectic Institute. We commenced in 1854 in June, and I was the only young lady to give a speech at commencement. Mine was about commerce. And we had prepared a colloquy for our parents, a play, if you will. And when we were rehearsing it on the stage, I tripped on a nail head that was sticking out of the floorboards, and I felt these strong arms grasp me before I hit the floor. And I looked up into these blue eyes and never looked at Mr. Garfield the same again. We talked about possibly marrying. You know, we were of the same religion. We loved learning. We loved reading. It was like breathing for us. We loved literature. We were taking all the same courses. He was not quite so comfortable about me speaking in public back then. It was a bit unladylike. But while he went off to Williams College in the East to finish his college education, I stayed here in Ohio and taught. I taught a little bit of French at the Eclectic Institute. I taught in Ravenna. I taught as far away as Bryan, Ohio, near Toledo. Took art lessons. I taught some drawing and art classes as well. My favorite posting was at the Brownell School in Cleveland. I was able to teach young people how to read. I was just delighted to be a teacher, to earn my own money, to attend the theater, to have some big city life. You know, Cleveland and Bryan, Ohio, a bit more than the farming communities of Hiram and Garrettsville. While Mr. Garfield was attending Williams College, he fell in love with another young lady, Rebecca Selleck. He began writing letters to me about meeting this young lady who reminded him of me. You would like her, he said. She's a fine Christian woman. My mother was very worried about me on how I was going to take this, because after reading a few of these letters, I think I was able to see through what was going on here. And she was afraid I would become an old maid. When it came time for commencement at Williams College in June of 1856, James invited both of us to the ceremonies. Once again, he was at the top of his class, and he gave a speech on the metaphysical world at that commencement. He had been on the debate club there. He had been writing in the newsletter and journal of the college. He had quite a college career at Williams. Now he had a choice. He was offered a job in Troy, New York, near Rebecca, and also offered a job at the Eclectic Institute in Hiram, back here in Ohio. I told him he was free to marry Rebecca. She was a fine Christian woman, but no one would ever love him as his dear Crete. I was called Crete in those letters we were writing to each other, and he was Jamie. And he took the job in Hiram, came back to Ohio, teaching ancient languages and mathematics. He had quite a career going. He was getting very busy, preaching somewhere on the Western Reserve every weekend. He was studying for the bar. He was elected to the Ohio Senate and had to go to Columbus, meeting with the legislature there. And we talked about marriage. And finally, in the spring of 1858, we took a carriage ride around Hiram, and we decided to try a life in union, and planned our wedding for November of that year at my father's farmhouse. I hand wrote my wedding invitations. It was a very small wedding. My brother Joseph advised me to send one to James Garfield to be sure he showed up. It pains me somewhat to tell you that our marriage began with the stern word duty. He married me out of duty. We have had such a long courtship, and the neighbors knew about the letters and the proposals, and by that time he had been made the principal of the college, what we would call a college president today. I'm sure my father put a little pressure on young James Garfield to do the right thing. So our wedding took place in November of 1858. We had no honeymoon. We couldn't afford our own home. So we began married life in Mrs. Northrup's boarding house, right there in Hiram, where he could work very easily at the college. He was now adding new classes, raising money for the school, getting more students. A very busy man. He was not sure that I was the right woman for him. Not convinced that I was passionate enough, because I told you I'm very shy and reserved. Now, in a letter, I could write very loving, flowing words. But face to face, things were very awkward between the two of us whenever we'd be in person with one another. He had this very outgoing nature. He wanted to be cuddly. And I was very shy and reserved. So I take part of the responsibility for our early years being rather awkward. My husband had a lot of duties and responsibilities, but also he wanted to be away from home. He was not ready to be a husband and father yet. And even the birth of our first child, Eliza Arabella, who we nicknamed Little Trot, did not keep her father home. He was in Columbus when someone broke through the door and said that Fort Sumter was fired upon. And so, like a lot of the men here, wanted to do his duty for his country and offered up his services to Governor Dennison and was given the 42nd Ohio Voluntary Infantry to raise the troops, train the troops, go off through Cincinnati into eastern Kentucky. So he was taken away from us for quite long absences. He got very ill during the war, again, like a lot of men, with camp fever. He had to be returned home so that I could help him recuperate. And he and Little Trot and I headed off to Howland Springs, to a little cabin there, near Warren, Ohio. It was truly the first time we had ever been alone together as a couple and with our little girl. We always had someone living with us. My mother-in-law, some of the students from Hiram, some of the teachers from Hiram, like Miss Booth. So this was our first chance to get to know one another on an extended basis. And I nursed him back to health while he had our daughter sitting on his lap, looking at his buttons on his uniform, calling those chickens when they were really eagles. And he lamented the fact that if anything should befall him in the war, Little Trot wouldn't remember him. He knew that by personal experience, having lost his father so young. But when he got well again, I had to return him to the Army and back into the field. And while he was in the war, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from our 19th district here in Ohio. Now he had a dilemma. It wasn't going to look very good if he left the war, would it? So he had to get some advice, and he turned to President Lincoln. And Lincoln said, I have plenty of generals and people that can take your place in the war. I need your help in Congress as a fellow Republican. So please resign your commission in the Army and take your seat at the Capitol building in December of 1863. And that's just what James did. Showed up in his Union uniform, resigned, took his seat in Congress. Those were rough times for us because we had a second child, Harry Augustus, who was born in October of 1863, a son. But not long after that, little Trot became ill with diphtheria. And we lost her in early December, right before James headed to Washington to take his seat in Congress. It tore at the atoms of our heart to lose our precious girl. And James was so distraught by this. I had to be the strong one. My mother's advice kept going through my head. I had to pull myself up here because I had a son I had to attend to, and my husband was heading to Washington. So at first he just stayed in boarding houses like you do when you're a rookie in Congress, sharing boarding houses with other congressmen. And the children came along. After our Harry Augustus came Jim, who was born in 1865, and then daughter Molly. Actually, her real name is Mary. She's named after my husband's sister, but we always call her Molly. She was born in 1867. Then came Irvin McDowell, named after the Civil War general, in 1870. Little Abe came along in 1872. And then finally, our seventh child was born, Edward, who we called Nettie, the day after Christmas in 1874. Poor Molly. She was distraught when she discovered she had another brother. She was outnumbered once again. Luckily, she's our happy child. She has the perfect temperament to have all these boys in her household. And she's one to cause some of the shenanigans herself sometimes. So don't feel too sorry for Molly. We unfortunately lost Nettie to whooping cough before he turned 2 years old. This little boy, to me, looks like what I picture young James Garfield, born in that log cabin. Bright blue eyes and sandy brown hair, just sort of a cherubic face. So like a lot of families, we lost children to childhood diseases. I think that made my husband want to keep the family closer. He now understood how important it was to have your family around you, to have your friends around you. You know, he saw horrible things in the war, things he wouldn't even discuss with us. And I think that drew us a bit closer. And so he finally decided that when he would head off to Congress and sessions that started in December and went through July each year, that he would take the family with him. So the Garfields became vagabonds. We packed up and headed to Washington and spent several months there and renting houses at first. And then in July, when there was a recess, we would head back to Ohio, sometimes staying in our home in Hiram that we had lived in, sometimes staying with my parents, or in a cabin up on Little Mountain in Lake County where the air was fresh and clean. But in 1869, James decided to borrow money and build a house of our own at 13th and I Streets, very close to the Capitol building. So now that made our trips even easier. We could keep a household established there. We could go back and forth between Ohio and also keep the family all close together and spend time with one another. So he has been a congressman for 17 years. Until last summer, when he went to the Republican convention as a delegate to nominate John Sherman of Ohio. You see, my husband did not have the presidential fever. He went as a delegate, hoping to get John Sherman elected as the 20th president, or at least as the representative from the Republican Party. But after many, many ballots were taken, none of the men who were seeking that office had a majority. There was a group that wanted U.S. Grant to have a third term. James Blaine, a senator from Maine, I know it sounds silly, but it's true, was trying to become the candidate for the Republican Party, and John Sherman was the third. So after 32 ballots, none of them had the majority of the votes. And my husband gave his speech for Sherman, and at the end of it, he said to all the people out in the audience, "What do we want?" And they yelled back, "Garfield for president." And on the 36th ballot, he had the majority of the votes. The Blaine's men and the Sherman men all went for my husband, and my husband sat there shocked that he was now going to be the Republican candidate for president. He tried to object, but the chairman of the convention said, "To sit down, Garfield, you do not have the floor." Gavelled, the convention concluded. I received a telegram at our farmhouse in Menor that said, "Dear wife, if the result meets your approval, I shall be content. My love to the household." I was scrubbing the kitchen floor. That's how I heard that he was going to become the Republican nominee for president. And even before he got home to Mentor, we had hordes of people showing up on our front lawn. People that wanted to get a job in his administration, folks that wanted to paint his portrait, some others that wanted to write books about him, people that wanted to see what candidate Garfield and his family looked like. So we have just concluded a very busy yet pleasant summer with a front porch campaign right off of our farmhouse in Mentor, Ohio. Over 17,000 people came. We had to resod the front yard. Someone took our front gate as a souvenir. And they took peaches and apples from our trees and some watermelons from the garden. Some of them camped overnight on our property. But my husband was elected on November 2nd, 1880. You know, even though he didn't have the presidential fever, once he was the nominee, of course he wanted to win. And I wanted him to be very successful. I had had a dream years ago that he was born for some important purpose, that he was going to rise up like a king of sorts and be someone important at a time when the country needed him. I didn't really want him to be the nominee as a last resort, as a compromise. I wanted him to be president when the whole nation called for it. But once, as I say, he received the nomination, we worked at everything that we could to get him elected president. He only won by about 10,000 votes, folks. So thank you, gentlemen who voted for him. Every one of your votes counted. And so, just a few months ago, he took his oath of office, March 4th, 1881. Here we are in May, just a few months later. That day was very raw and disagreeable in Washington. Rainy snow and sleet in the morning, but somehow at 12 p.m., the clouds broke just in time for the ceremonies. And I watched as my husband stood with the magnificence of that moment and said his inaugural address to the people of this nation. That night, we slept soundly in the White House with the ghosts of presidents and first ladies from the past 60 years all around us, I suppose. We were so exhausted, having been through the inauguration ceremony and a parade and a dinner and inaugural ball. We didn't get to sleep till after 11:30 in the evening. Mr. Garfield didn't dance. So we got home probably a little more timely than other presidential couples. And you know, now that the children are about 9 to 19 years old, and we're all in the White House together, we have that close-knit family together again. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, when your children get older in age, you and your spouse can join a literary society. Mr. Garfield is the president of the one in Washington right now. We can go to the theater. We can read books on Shakespeare to the children and take them with us. Now, there are some shenanigans going on in the White House. I discovered that Irvin was riding down the main stairway into the East Room on his bicycle. And he and his brother Abe were into fisticuffs at the dinner table the other night before I headed here to see you folks. But Molly surprised me. She held a little tea luncheon for some of the daughters of the cabinet members, and she knew well enough to put Fannie Hayes, the daughter of the previous president, at the head of the table. And there were 10 young ladies having a tea luncheon in the White House just a few weeks ago. My plan is to refurbish the White House. It's getting quite shabby. That's a polite word for it. You know, hundreds of people come through every week. The men looking for jobs in the government, they spit in the spittoons and sometimes miss. The carpets are tattered and worn. And so Mr. Garfield and I went to the Library of Congress the other day, and we visited Mr. Spofford, the librarian, and he gave us a few books on the history of the White House. I hope to get some of the furnishings returned and to do some of the historic things in the house that should be there. You know, a lot of things have been sold over the years, and some of those visitors take souvenirs when they come to the People's House. You know, they pull out their pocket knife and take a piece of the drapery or a piece of the wooden chair, some of the carpeting home with them, because anyone can come on our reception nights as long as you're properly dressed. And that does not mean a tuxedo and a ball gown. You can shake the hands of the President and the First Lady in our bi-weekly receptions. So as we begin this new aspect of our relationship, I hope that we can accomplish much in the 4 years that we're going to have in the White House. Even the newspapers are calling us an affectionate partnership. We're getting close to our 23rd anniversary this year in November. And so I think back on what drew us closer together. Having our children, losing some to childhood illnesses, the Civil War, Congress bringing us together in one home for several months in the year. You know, we always had the things that we enjoyed in common: our reading, our love of languages, our church. But now we have these other things that are pulling us together. I guess you could say that the forces drawing us apart were not as strong as the forces pulling us together. So I hope that as fellow Ohioans, President Garfield and I can represent you, is the word I'm trying to say, represent you all in fine fashion in Washington. I see by the clock I've been speaking a while, and Mr. Garfield warned me that it was not proper to take the time of an audience unless one is prepared to instruct and arouse. I hope I was able to do both this evening for you folks. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain any questions you may have. We are not shy about things in the Garfield household. Yes, ma'am.
Because I'm in the front row.
Yes.
The Orange Township, is that Orange?
Orange Township, as far as I know, is now made up of Orange, Solon, Hunting Valley, a couple other communities, Moreland Hills. Yes, Moreland Hills, thank you. Yes. Just like your township, I think, is now several communities as well. You know, we had all of our surveying done long ago, right? Where our townships were these nice blocks of land that were then made into other villages and towns once you became large enough to do so. You had a question, ma'am?
Do any of the original homesteads still exist?
Yes. Do any of the original homesteads exist? We have a group called the Garfield Trail. This is your commercial for the evening. A nonprofit group called the Garfield Trail that represents, that's not the right word, promotes and helps preserve the legacy of James Garfield and his family at the 4 main sites here in Northeast Ohio. In Moreland Hills, there's a replica log cabin that's up closer to Som Center Road, so it looks very much the way it did back in the 1830s through the 1850s. Then the house in Hiram that the Garfields lived in is still there. It's right across from the college, and that's still there. The Mentor Farm is still there. Some of you told me you have visited out there, the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. Now open 7 days a week this time of the year, folks. And finally, the Garfields are interred at Lakeview Cemetery in the Garfield Memorial. They are in the lower crypt area of the memorial, which has been undergoing a wonderful restoration project, and they will be open for the Memorial Day observance that's coming up. So yes, a lot of the original places still exist, as well as some of the secondary sites. You know, James Garfield's imprint is everywhere around Northeast Ohio. You folks have claimed to that. This lectern was used by James Garfield in the Disciples Church here in Bedford. And Jack was kind enough to bring it out to let me use it this evening. But we have Solon and Chagrin Falls, lots of areas that have Garfield's touch in one way or another. Yes, a follow-up?
Did any of your children go into politics?
Oh, a couple of them dabbled in politics. Here's the 5 in the White House. This is a Matthew Brady photograph of those 5 children, the 4 boys and Molly there. This is the only photograph we have of our family in the White House, believe it or not. The 2 oldest brothers, Hal and Jim, dabbled in politics a bit. Hal was the fuel administrator during World War I under President Woodrow Wilson. And Jim was the Secretary of the Interior in Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet. He also was a state senator, like his father before him. And there was talk of Jim running for president at one point. That did not occur, but those are the 2 that dabbled in politics. The others didn't want to have anything to do with it. Yes, sir.
You're fortunate to have photos from 1850, since photography was basically starting around 1830s.
You're right.
And then the man you mentioned was very famous. Brady, was it?
Yes. Matthew Brady made it his goal to try to photograph every important person that was alive at that time. And so there's quite a collection of his photographs in addition to our family. Yes, sir.
Did Mr. Garfield ever speak about his days on the Ohio Erie Canal?
Oh, yes. Yes. Did he speak about his days on the Ohio and the Erie Canal? Yes, you know, he left home because he wanted to be a sailor. That was really what he wanted to be when he grew up. He loved reading adventure stories. He had a book called The Pirate's Own Book, and he was reading all these wonderful escapades of these pirates in the 7 seas and such, and so he thought he wanted to be a sailor, and he left home and went up to where the canal goes into Lake Erie in Cleveland and tried to get a job on a ship, and the drunk captain threw him off the ship and said, "Don't ever come back here again." So my husband said that seemed like the end of his sailing days, but luckily he had a cousin who was the owner of the Evening Star, a canal boat. And he hired James on to help him with the canal boat. Now, his job was not on the boat. His job was to walk on the tow path, helping the mule or the horse pull the boat. And so he was on the canal about 6 weeks because he became very ill with malaria after falling into that canal water 14 times. I thought this was an exaggeration, folks, but sure enough, when one of those campaign biographers came to our manor farm and interviewed James Garfield, I heard him tell him, I fell in 14 times on my first day. And so he became ill with the ague, as we call it, and had to go home. And that was a very fortunate thing because now Eliza could take hold of her son, not physically, but mentally, and convince him that going back to the canal was a bad idea. Lots of bad stuff going on there, that it was better if he went to school. And that's when she gave him her $17 to entice him to do the right thing. Yes, ma'am?
How did you end up and why did you go to California?
You know a lot about me. Here in May of 1881, I don't know about going to California, but we'll step out of character a little bit. When Molly married, she married a young man named Joseph Stanley Brown, and eventually he worked for the Union Pacific Railway, which took her out to Pasadena, California, so Lucretia wisely became a snowbird. Oh. And she would leave northern Ohio as the rough winters approached and would head west to warmer climate, to palm trees and orange groves, first to visit Molly, and then she actually bought a parcel of land on a corner of Buena Vista and Meridian streets. And that house, too, to continue with your question about do any of the houses still exist, that house still exists as well. And it is privately owned. It sold probably about 5 years ago now for about $3 to $4 million. And the person who sold it at that time was Madonna's sister and brother-in-law. They did a very nice job in restoring the house. And so the current owner also has been getting some grant money to continue restoring the house and putting it back to the way Lucretia had it. You know, she would head back to Ohio then in the spring when the weather got better. Yes?
That portrait there?
Yes.
You haven't mentioned that. Is that a wedding?
This is considered our engagement photo. So taken in 1857, 1858. Yes. The most we have of a wedding picture. Mm-hmm. James Garfield's hair is a bit more tame here. I have the double part that was very popular. You may have seen Mary Todd with a part like that at that time too in the 1850s. That was quite the fashion. Anything else? Yes?
Besides you and your husband both here back in Ohio buried, any of your children buried or any other family members buried here?
Yes, this is a yes answer with an asterisk because my husband and I are not buried. We are interred in the Garfield Memorial in the crypt area. We are above ground. We are the only presidential couple that I know of that are laid to rest above ground and not encased in marble. So you can see President Garfield's casket draped with an American flag. I am right beside him, and Molly and her husband are cremated in urns that are in that same crypt area. Abram, the youngest son, is buried not too far away in the Williams plot, as in Sherwin Williams. He married Sarah Williams. So he's in the Williams plot that's not too far away from Rockefeller's plinth, if you know where that is. Let's see, James is buried in Mentor, in the Mentor Cemetery with his family. Hal and Irv are both buried in Boston, in the Boston area, because that's where their jobs took them, and they spent quite a bit of their lives there. So that's all of us.
How many grandchildren?
Oh, We all like to talk about grandchildren. I ended up having 16 grandchildren. All 5 of those children, these children grew up to be adults, got married, had homes and children of their own, so 16 grandchildren. 3 great-grandchildren that I knew of before I don't remember anything, past 1918. 1918. So a very large family, probably several hundred around the country today, about 20 or so right in this area, including one in this room. Tim Garfield is a great-great-grandson of the president. Do you see the family resemblance? If he stood up, you'd see he's over 6 feet tall also. Yes, Tim is a great-great-grandson related through James R., the second son of the family. Are you giving away secrets, family secrets back there?
No, but since you talked about your 2 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, do your math program for everybody, because this is the one that we all have fun with.
Yes, the 16 children had 45 children, and they had 118 children. And so now I need to really count the 3 greats and the 4 greats, because have we started on 5 greats yet?
Not that I know of.
All right, so we're into the 4 greats. And Tim is hoping to somehow corral this large family that's around the country into a family reunion one day in the near future. And that would be wonderful. They could come visit all of you here in Bedford and all these other places we've talked about that have the Garfield connection. So, any of you have Garfields in your family history and your genealogy?
Not my personal, but there is an Eleanor Garfield Hall in Richfield.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one that James Kirby built that's on Railroad Springs, so it bounces when you go through it.
Mm-hmm.
Eleanor is one of James R.'s daughter-in-laws.
Right. She married into the family. Mm-hmm.
She's one of the few in that, well, she's the other in that generation that took a political turn. She was mayor of Bedford.
Yes.
That's right. Eleanor Borton Garfield married into the Garfield family, was the first woman mayor of Mentor, Ohio, and to this date, the only woman mayor that we have had in Mentor. And she was quite something. She was a flapper as a young girl. One of those young ladies raised in the 1920s. She had a Jordan car, a Jordan automobile inspired by her. She talked to the owners of the company and said, "Why don't you make an automobile for people like us? Your cars are so boring." And so he created a snazzy red Jordan Playboy, he called it, inspired by Eleanor. And if you look that up, there's some wonderful advertising that goes with that Jordan Playboy. You know, the woman driving the car's hair is blowing in the wind, and, you know, she's out having an adventurous time. Yes, in the back. Oh, go ahead, sir.
I was just wondering if Garfield Heights is named after James Garfield.
Yes, a combination of James Garfield and his Uncle Thomas. Uncle Thomas was his favorite uncle. Uncle Thomas was brother to Abram Garfield, and Uncle Thomas became very wealthy, speculated in land. Eliza, his sister-in-law, didn't like that too much. She worried about that, but Uncle Thomas owned quite a bit of land in what is now Garfield Heights at, I'm trying to remember, but the road, what's the name of the road? Yes. So he gave some of his property for the asylum that was built in Garfield Heights. He gave it away free, gave 50 acres of his property for the asylum that was built there. And so it's a combination between James Garfield and his favorite uncle, who, by the way, they were both born on November 19th, 30 years apart. So James Garfield felt like his birth star was connected to his uncle. And here's the real ironic part, folks. A couple of days before James Garfield was shot, Uncle Thomas was killed in a carriage versus train accident in Warrensville. Uncle Thomas thought he could beat the train across the tracks. So James Garfield has his last cabinet meeting in the White House. He didn't know it was his last. Has his last cabinet meeting and gets the word that Uncle Thomas died in this accident, along with a cousin, a female cousin of James Garfield's. But yes, Garfield Heights definitely has that connection too. See, we could go probably almost every town and village in Northeast Ohio. Yes, ma'am, you have another question.
Well, compliment to your knowledge and
Oh.
background on the Garfield.
Thank you very much.
It really is. How did you get interested in?
Well, I started by working at the Garfield site in Mentor, back when the Western Reserve Historical Society ran it. So 1998, I started there giving tours and working with school groups and creating programs. And there was a man there who looked very much like James Garfield, who also was giving tours and such. And he had been going out around the community portraying James Garfield for quite a while. So I started in 1998. He'd been doing this since 1985. And he said to me one day when we were waiting for our tour, "Have you ever considered portraying Lucretia Garfield?" I said, "No, I don't even look like her. She looks like Julia Roberts." And besides, Ed was his name, had community theater background. I had nothing like that. I am actually very much like Lucretia. It doesn't seem like it, but I am very introverted. And so he convinced me that if I had the right clothes and studied up enough about her that I could pull it off. And so we appeared together for the very first time in June of 2001. And like I told these folks, I was arm candy that day. I didn't say very much. I just held General Garfield's arm for a Civil War encampment and a ice cream social. And so I've gone out since then to talk to groups and community and things. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you very much, Lucretia.
You're welcome.